We are live, and I have figured out how to play the intro. This is Anarcho-Catholic. I'm Kath, here with Bulge again. We have once again taken over the AT Austertomism podcasting from Caleb. How's it going, Bulge?
Going well.
So
looking at diagrams. You'll understand this, dear viewer, in the future. You will, trust me. I will make you understand.
Understand might be the wrong word. So we are going to be picking up our discussion of Jacques Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge. We did chapter 1 about 2 weeks ago, doing chapter 2 today. We'll do chapter 3 when we actually find time to read it and organize something. Appreciate you being here over the Christmas holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Guess we'll just go ahead and dive into it if that works for you.
Yeah, it works for me. Where do you want to begin? Do you want to start from the beginning, or do you
I think that'll work. So this is chapter 1 was sort of the introductory chapter, and Maritain doesn't have it fit into the bigger scheme of his book. Chapter 2 is the first chapter of what he calls the first part, the degrees of rational knowledge, philosophy, and experimental science. This is going to be followed in the second part. Let me get the name, but it's when he moves on to more revelatory forms of knowledge and mysticism and the like. So the second part is the degrees of supra-rational knowledge. So we're starting here with philosophy and experimental science, and what would we call rational sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so what he does, go ahead.
No, he's introducing to us what he calls the critical realist or critical intellectualist. I much prefer the former to the latter, of a critical realist approach, what he calls it, but it is essentially a Thomistic Aristotelian approach to epistemology at the very and classification of science. Because I've never seen this before, a classification of science. I've seen Aristotelian and Thomistic epistemology as well, but he does a very thorough job, in some cases too thorough with certain diagrams, of classifying what he calls science, wisdom, metaphysics into different categories of knowledge. And he really lives up to the title Degrees of Knowledge. He puts it in steps. He shows it all to you, sometimes more than you would have liked. And, but he does a thorough job of it. I can at least say that much.
Yeah. And I think it is important to sort of go through this, because if he's trying to show how it is that we know and what it is that we know, we really have to put things in their proper order. Especially because his ultimate goal is, like I said, is to start talking about supra-rational or revelatory knowledge. Mm-hmm. And you can't really make sense of that if you don't understand, first sensory knowledge and then knowledge that comes from the intellect directly. So bit of a longer chapter than the first one, but I think it's a lot. He moves away a lot from the as much the very over the top prose of chapter 1, mm-hmm. and really lays things out, I think, in a very logical, very consistent manner. It was much easier reading for me than chapter 1 was.
Much easier. I will say, though, I ignored the footnotes, because they do get to be page long footnotes.
There was one that was an entire page. Yeah.
Yes, and they're a much smaller font, so I did tend to ignore them because I assumed they weren't important to his main points.
The thing that drove me crazy, because I did try and read the footnotes, but whenever he quotes St. Thomas, he always, and I don't know about if your version does the same thing, it's always entirely in Latin with no translation. So there'll be like a half-page footnote that is entirely in Latin.
Yes.
And I'll just have to say, okay, I assume this is relevant to what you were talking about, but I'm going to have to move on.
I assume this is accurate. Thank you, Maritain. I'll come back to you in 30 years when I can speak Latin.
Right. So a sort of trivial thing, but I wanted to point out, because he calls his framework, like you said, either critical intellectualist or critical realist. And unfortunately, the critical as a modifier of any kind of science has become such a obscenity in the modern vernacular, because it's really been taken over by
the critical theorists, let's call it.
Marxist, essentially. Like, it has become very much a leftist Marxist kind of description. Not what Maritain's doing, but unfortunately, I mean, he's writing this in the 20s or the 30s, when you could still refer to critical science and not just be lumping yourself with all the worst of academia. So the name probably requires some revision, but he does call it critical realist. It is not critical in the sense of any kind of critical theory in the.
It is not Gramscian. I will say that much at all.
Yes, exactly.
It is very,
like you said, it is very much scholastic or Aristotelian Thomist in its perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you have any preliminary notes? Because I do actually have one thing which kind of shocked me that I didn't realize before, which
Go for it.
we'll get into deeper when we get into the chapter proper. But what really, it almost pissed me off, and I didn't think of this. One comment he has, which is sort of central to the entire thesis of this chapter, is that immaterial things are more intelligible to the intellect than material things. And this might sound esoteric and like not at all obvious, but when you realize he's using mathematics as an example and how essentially the discovery of what he calls physical mathematical sciences as a way to categorize regularities in nature is so obvious to us because maths is not itself tangible at all. You cannot touch a perfect isosceles triangle. You cannot touch a perfect equilateral triangle. You cannot touch a perfect right angle triangle in the real world.
There are no fours floating around in nature.
But it is so much easier to comprehend and to analyze than a triangle than a something which approximates a triangle, which has a 181 degrees, and then you need to compensate for this or that side, and then to be able to sort of apply roughly the Pythagorean theorem to calculate this other side, which you don't know, and so on and so forth, which would be, the thing in real life. It's so much more intelligible to actually focus on the immaterial and then approximate to the material once you understand the essence of what this is approximating. And it's so obvious once he says it, but it's something that really, that was, I think, my main takeaway from this chapter was the intelligibility of immaterial things compared to material things and abstraction and the process of abstraction. Those are the main takeaways that I had.
It was, I can't remember if it was, I read it somewhere else, but it was either St. Thomas or it was Maritain that says that mathematics is the most connatural to man's understanding in terms of the sciences. Like it is the most, in tune with our way of thinking, because like you said, that it is immaterial in its nature and therefore graspable the intellect, but everything we know about mathematics we don't intuit. He says later on, he talks about the foundation of math is you've seen a circle at some point, you've seen 3 of something at some point, and then as soon as you grasp the essence of the math that's in the thing, then it's all intellect, and your intellect can just do what it does and reason through and use deductive reasoning to grasp the whole of mathematics.
Yes, once you've abstracted the relevant, what this thing is approximating, the essence of what this thing really is, then you can actually reason closer to, then you can actually get to mathematics, and you can get to the other sciences, and then eventually, if you abstract to the upteenth degree, to the maximum degree, you get to metaphysics of what this thing really is, of what its essence is in its relation to the first cause, that being God.
So I want to dive into that a little bit more deeply shortly, because I want to just summarize briefly, because he starts out sort of trying to identify what he means by science and what science is, what the object of science is, and what he concludes is that science, what he calls is that it's knowledge perfect in its mode, or the mind pointing out in things their reasons for being, and really trying to what he's going to end up with is the idea of essence or nature, as Aristotle and St. Thomas describe it, as separate from Plato's idea of Platonic forms, is that you have that things have an essence that is immaterial and perfect in our abstraction of it. And then it exists, specifically in a thing. So there is a human nature. I think this human nature exists in each of us, but it's only in the mind that there's a universal universal nature common to all men.
Yes, he has he talks a lot about this. He's very much more Aristotelian than necessarily the scholastic combination of the chapter, because he doesn't talk about God much, if at all. I certainly don't remember if he does. So he's very much more Aristotelian, partly because he realizes a third man problem indirectly, and the other problems of Platonic realism, in the sense that Platonic realism essentially says that everything participates in a certain form. So a horse participates in the form of a horse, a man participates in the form of a rational animal. This leads to 2 main problems. The first one, famously articulated by Plato himself, who is very good at formulating objections to his own main arguments, is the third man problem, which means essentially, okay, let's say that a man participates in the form of man. Well, if the form of man is an object, then what is that participating in? because it can't just be by itself if we've established that everything that exists by participation in another idea or in another form. So you need to postulate a super form of man. And what does that participate in? Well, in a super form of man, and so on in an infinite regress. Now, this has been hotly debated over the millennia, as you can imagine, of whether, what kind of thing is a form, is a Platonic form, whether it needs to participate in something, and if it does not need, what does that imply about what it is, and so on and so forth. And the other problem is the separation of ideas. So if man is a rational animal, and that is the essence of man, but we also know that animality exists in, dogs and cats and birds, then how can man participate as a rational animal? Does he have an animality, or is rational animal a separate form entirely from animality? Is rational animal, or is it a combination of two forms? And if so, how does that work? And if it is a third form, then how can we say he has animality and call him an animal if it doesn't participate in the form of animality? And so on and so forth. So he sort of has an Aristotelian, almost conceptualist outlook on this, that these forms only exist separate in the mind of the scientist or the metaphysician who undertakes to understand them. And he, I guess that would be my main point here. He doesn't much talk about the scholastic realism so far, but he does talk about the Aristotelian version of abstraction and how universals exist in nature. I have a few quotes here that are relevant if you want to get into them, but you say anything first. If you
go. I think that's an excellent summary of the Platonic versus Aristotelian position. Mm-hmm. Go ahead and jump into the quotes.
Okay, so first he has a quote where he sort of sets up this problem. So he's talking about knowledge and science. How can science be stable if the object on which it lays holds is not necessary? It is merely contingent. How could a changeable and contingent object give rise to stable knowledge, one which could not be false? Furthermore, would a thing be explained? Would we be giving a reason for it if, once its reason for being were posited, it could be otherwise? That is the problem from which the very beginning has been thrust upon philosophical reflection. It is the problem which led Plato, when confronted with the fact of certain knowledge, to set up a world of divine ideas. So he's already setting up realism. And then he goes on to say, let me see if this underlining is necessary for the main point. Well, I'll read it anyway, and then we'll find out. It is absolutely necessary to distinguish the thing with which science is concerned, this table, the specific table that I have in front of me, for instance, and the perfectly precise object, the formal object upon which it lays hold, and from which it derives its stability. For instance, the geometric properties of this table, when considered in its shape, are the physical chemical properties of the wood from which it is made, or the laws of its manufacture. The latter, the object, does not exist when separated from the thing, except in our mind, and yet it is not confused with it. On the contrary, they exist in a concrete and singular condition. Human nature exists in each of us, but only in the mind is it a universal nature common to all men. In each of us, it is Paul's or John's nature. So he's very much an Aristotelian here. He's not talking about the divine ideas and the divine intellect. He's talking about how it pertains to us, how the universals are manifest in nature without reference to the divine intellect. Is how he's trying to explain it in this chapter, at least.
I remember a discussion I was having with a mutual friend of ours about knowledge as it relates to physics. And this seemed to be a sticking point in terms of necessary truth, because their focus is on. I think
I can guess who the friend is.
I think you probably have a decent guess who this was. And this is the point that, of course, Maritain makes better than I ever could. But that the object of science, and this applies to all sciences, is necessarily true things. The conclusions of science, or at least deductive science, is necessarily true. It is saying things that are actually true, even though it's saying them about things that are not themselves, that are themselves contingent. Mm-hmm. Right, and it does this through this understanding of that the actual object of the sciences is essences, is the nature of things.
Mm-hmm. One of his most important discussions later on in the second half of his chapter, or at least that I found most important in the beginning of the second half, is that science depends upon philosophy only in principle but not in practice. So this is sort of obvious. I think even Hoppe talks about this if you're a libertarian and you've read him, where he sort of opposes Thomas Kuhn's paradigm of he doesn't oppose Thomas Kuhn. He sort of accepts it and explains how can science progress if every now and then we have a complete paradigm shift, which sort of upsets the entire nature of scientific advancement in the sense that it completely switches over how we've understood the element so far. So, the phlogiston theory of combustion to the understanding what oxygen is and how that works, or many other revolutions that you can think of. How does that work? How does science keep advancing, even if, every now and then we have this whole upset in the first principles of science, not of metaphysics, but of science relative to the whole? Well, Hoppe sort of has a similar conclusion from an entirely different angle, that, science is ultimately a practical affair in a sense. That Hoppe says it's concerned of handwerk, or handwork, the work of the hand, where it's trying to understand regularities in nature. So that would be the aspect in which science does not depend upon philosophy, but to explain itself and justify its method and understand what the thing it's studying really is, then in principle, it relies upon philosophy and metaphysics.
Excellent. I said, and to that extent that he brings this up later, is it possible for science to sort of overturn the conclusions of philosophy?
Mm-hmm.
And says it's really only in so much as philosophy sort of oversteps what it knows, if it tries to make claims on the scientific that aren't firmly formed in its principles. So I could go on about this at length. I probably will try and refrain a little bit from talking too much about principles of science. But that's another interesting distinction that I think he makes, and I want to ask you about this. We won't discuss the diagram just yet, I don't think.
Just yet. No. We have more to cover before that, I think. We have to explain the prelude to that beforehand.
So am I good to go ahead and jump into the degrees of abstraction, or should we? Is there more you want to say before that?
You just commented on what did you just comment on? Sorry.
So this was philosophy being able to, or science being able to overturn philosophical conclusions.
Yes, he sort of one thing that I found somewhat entertaining is that he very strongly says that science can never, ever overturn philosophical conclusions, which is true. He's completely right to make that claim. But what he does say as sort of a concession, or really sort of, as necessary, is that, philosophy is derived from beings in the world. We are experiencing beings, so we make mistakes and overstep our bounds, or even derives or have an infra-scientific experience that is just an experience in the world, just as a matter of empirical fact, that we then wrongly interpret and form a wrong metaphysical basis for it. So Parmenides, for example, I'm sure that he didn't think of the act potency distinction, so he thought that change is impossible. And so he derived a wrong conclusion from his experience in the world, but better understanding of science, maybe, or at least more empirical knowledge and more reflection upon such empirical knowledge, could have actually changed Parmenides' mind, or something like that. That's as far as he goes in terms of concession to empiricism, let's say.
Right, because by its nature, philosophy is always higher than science. So, and I think that sort of brings us to the next thing that the next distinction he makes between sciences of explanation and sciences of observation. And I think this gets into a lot of what he talks about later in the chapter. But he makes a distinction between what I think we would call inductive sciences, which are more phenomenological, that can be, okay, we see this property, we see this relationship in nature between things. It's sort of a more of a fact finding, even in the, as you mentioned, in sort of the modern era, it becomes what he calls physico-mathematical, is that you have mathematicized a lot of these relationships, but they are still just descriptive in essence, versus sciences of explanation, which actually try and uncover what the essences of things are, that actually try and give some kind of ontological explanation for the thing. It's interesting. I feel like it might be a suffering of the translation. It confuses me a little bit because he calls both of those sciences, there's sciences of observation and science of explanation. But later on, he makes a distinction between science and philosophy, where science seems to just be science of observation, and philosophy would seem to be a science of explanation. Did that confuse you as well, or is it? Am I missing something?
Let me see. Okay, so one of the quotes I put in my own notes, I just put it as a whole, is that I think he's categorizing everything as a science, but then he divides science into two. So outside of all the distinctions he's made already into science, into the degrees of abstraction and the higher types and lower types of knowledge from, empirical science, not yet mathematized, to physical mathematics, to pure mathematics, to philosophy of nature, and then to metaphysics. So outside of that, science in general includes two great areas. First, there is the realm of wisdom, which knows things through first causes and the highest reasons for being. So that is understanding the principles of being itself. Then there's the domain of science in the narrow sense, which knows things through second causes, approximate principles. Metaphysics would be a wisdom, and everything else would be just a science in the narrow sense. Unless you use it he also makes another distinction within this, where he calls a wisdom in the relative sense, which is such as understanding Newton's three laws of motions. You can then derive, a whole bunch of classical mechanics from just understanding those three basic principles. And that would be a wisdom in a relative sense. So I think he calls everything which is knowledge science, as far as I understood, unless he contradicts himself at some point, which I missed.
Again, man, that was my impression too. Is that all of it would be broadly referred to as science, but then he seemed to have a further specification. Maybe it's a labeling thing. If only he made some kind of diagram that clarified that. Before we get to that, though, I do want to talk briefly about the degrees of abstraction that he goes into, because this is something you see a lot and sort of I think is worth noting. Mm-hmm. Is that, again, the way we derive essences, the way we find out about essences is we abstract them from real things, right?
Yes.
The human nature doesn't exist as its own thing. It exists in individual people. The nature of any kind of matter, the essence doesn't exist of itself. It exists specified in matter for any material thing. And so there's different modes of abstraction that the intellect does.
Yeah. The first one, which he calls, he says the ancients called it physica. Mm-hmm. Knowledge of sensible nature is the first degree of abstraction. And this is when the mind considers bodies in their mobile and sensible realities, bodies garbed in their empirically ascertainable qualities and properties. Such an object can neither exist without matter and the qualities bound up with it, nor can it be conceived without matter. So this is when you're basically entirely occupied with the material world. Such a degree of abstraction cannot even conceive of something without the matter associated with it. This is physica, the first degree, what the ancients called physica, I should say, the first degree of abstraction.
And this would include virtually all the modern, what we call hard sciences. So this would incorporate physics, chemistry, biology, to the extent that it's not dealing with rational beings. So that in this terminology, if you were studying ants or plants or anything else, this would all be under physica, because this is a changeable being, and as purely changeable. Yes, that's the other thing I've heard is physica is abstraction, is being as changeable being, as material being.
That is actually a very good way to put it in more classical Aristotelian terms instead of 20th century French Aristotelian terms. Being as changeable being. I think that's how Aristotle actually defines physics, correct?
Right. I think so. I mean, again, he would have been doing it in the Greek, but I have no idea what route it was taken.
He didn't write into 21st century English, certainly. But yes, that is the first degree of abstraction. The second one is when the mind considers objects abstracted from and purified of matter, insofar as matter is the general basis for the active and passive sensible properties of bodies. In this case, it considers nothing more than a certain property which isolates within bodies, a property that remains when everything sensible is left aside, quantity, number, or the extended taken in itself. Now, this is the important part. So this is an object of thought which cannot exist without sensible matter, but can be conceived without it. For nothing sensible or experimental enters into the definition or the ellipse of a square root. This is the great field of mathematica, knowledge of quantity as such. So you sort of understand why he's using the word abstraction, because abstraction means, if I remember correctly, if I remember my I can't actually tell if it's Greek or Latin at the moment. But if I remember my ancient languages correctly, abstraction means to cut away from or to cut something out of. So you're essentially cutting everything else that is irrelevant to your consideration, which can be considered immaterially without the sensible matter, and then considering that property. So that would be, let's say there is a chasm in an ocean, the Mariana Trench. And we can sort of consider it as the Mariana Trench, as we can sort of draw it as viewed from space on a paper. But then someone can say, what about the depth? And we can reply, we're not interested in the depth. We're only interested in these squiggly lines to map out the surface. We're only interested in what we can describe in the Cartesian chart mathematically to then get at the root of its surface and so on and so forth without considering the depth, because that's irrelevant to our considerations here. That would be the second degree of abstraction, what the ancients called mathematica, knowledge of quantity as such.
And so, if anyone's familiar with Aristotle's categories, I don't know if you've read it or touched on it at all, Bulge.
I have it here, but I have not read it yet. I have a basic works of Aristotle right next to me, so I have it here, but I haven't read it yet.
Sure, but in that, so the sort of first property of substances is quantity. It's the most fundamental one. Is that nothing is physical that doesn't have quantity. And so if you keep quantity and get rid of everything else, so all of its qualities, where it is, what it's in relation to, all those sort of extra things, and just reduce it to quantity, to amount or extension, like he says, that's where math comes from. And you can make it discrete, and you can do arithmetic, or you can make it continuous, and you can do geometry. And as they've advanced, they sort of have merged together into one thing in the modern level. But that's fundamentally what mathematics is. It's this understanding of the quantity of things abstracted away from everything else that makes them physical substances. And as you pointed out very very well, is that the quantity doesn't exist outside of matter. You can't have, like I said, there aren't fours floating around in the air. There aren't perfect triangles. There aren't angles of themselves. They exist in physical things, but we can conceive them as their own things, and we can do manipulations with them, and we can deduce all these fascinating consequences of those objects. But we have to abstract them away from actual matter where they really exist. Otherwise, they only exist in the mind.
Yes, this sort of becomes this is just an interesting side note, but this becomes a real problem for the Kantians, who've both Roger Scruton, who's a Kantian light, and Hoppe, who is very much a sort of neo-Kantian in his epistemology, sort of run into a problem into what the hell is mathematics? Because is it transcendental? Like, where do we get it from? Do we get it from action in the world as a priori category of action, or is an a priori category of the mind? And Hoppe sort of leans into the answer that it's a category of action, that we can only really derive it from I do one action, then I do another, he's very much an economic theorist, so he leans into that direction. Scruton sort of leans into the direction that Kant's just wrong about this, and Aristotle is right. That's sort of the direction he leans into. And Maritain obviously doesn't even consider the Kantians here. He sort of only makes fun of them in the first chapter. Very beautifully makes fun of it. I wish I had the quote in mind, but I don't.
It's the proper role of Kantians in any kind of serious philosophical discussion is you bring them up as an aside to insult them, and then you just ignore them again.
I'm one of the few people who likes Kant's comments on beauty and aesthetics, but yeah, that's very true in terms of epistemology.
Probably our biggest philosophical disagreement is you think there are things worth reading in Kant, and I just refuse. Nope, Aristotle did it better. Kant's just is a Cartesian in philosopher's clothing, and should be considered nothing more.
Yeah, my favorite Brazilian philosopher recently passed away this year, Olavo de Carvalho, also another Catholic. He had a great comment, which he did in one of his online classes, which was, in ancient philosophy, such as Aristotle, Plato, and their students, such as Xenophon and so forth, you can sort of take away the essence of what they're saying is pretty much correct, and there are certain observations, such as, Aristotle's physics and so on, that are incorrect in places, and you need to amend those with modern empirical observations and more knowledge of the empirical world. Essentially, their illustrations are wrong, but their points are correct. Whereas in modern philosophy, from Descartes onwards, everything they say in essence is wrong, but they have very interesting observations.
That is perfect.
So you need to pay attention to those observations, but with rare exceptions, you don't need to pay attention to what their point is. And I sort of agree with that to a large extent.
And I'm going to be obnoxious and pedantic and defend Aristotle, is that I think his physics, in terms of his physica, as he would call it, is excellent. His mechanics is garbage, but that's very much a specification. Like if we mean physics the way that he meant it originally, as physica, as the state of changeable being, he makes his observations are absolutely fantastic. It's when he actually tries to start making them empirical and tries to do mechanics in particular that it kind of falls apart. As we said, for him, physics would include chemistry and biology and botany and everything else. And so in his own terms, his physics is fantastic. It's a very minor specification of his physics.
I mean, his idea of time, or well, his very implicit ideas of time are probably some of the most prescient observations about the nature of time as only subject to what is changeable in the world and not what is unchangeable, such as the unmoved mover and so forth, for some of the most prescient observations about what the nature of time can possibly be, which is it's a major problem in philosophy. I mean, Augustine cracked his head against this for quite a long while in the Confessions and sort of gave up with a prayer. But in a sense, he's only echoing Aristotle's comments on it as what is time after all, and which is another major problem for the Kantians. It's less of a problem for Aristotelians, but it's still a very unknown quantity how to even consider time. But yeah, I think it's some of the most prescient observations in that sense. So he can't have been all wrong about physica after all. Should we get to the third degree of abstraction?
Go for it.
Okay. So finally, the mind can consider objects abstracted from and purified of all matter. In this case, it considers in things only the very being with which they are saturated, being as such and its laws. These are objects of thought which not only can be conceived without matter, but which can even exist without it, whether they never exist in matter, as in the case of God and pure spirits, or whether they exist in material as well as in material things, for example, substance, quality, act and potency, beauty, goodness, etc. This is the wide domain of metaphysica, knowledge of that which is beyond sensible nature or of being as such, the third degree of abstraction. And that's it.
Yep. So these are the degrees of abstraction we start when we have being as changeable, being as quantity, and then being as being itself. So we have things that are necessarily material, things that are material but can be conceived as immaterial, and things that can be formally immaterial, like I said, God or substance as such, or beauty, or the transcendentals.
And he sort of has very soon afterwards, he has an interesting comment that knowledge works in sort of the way in this way of knowledge we proceed to wider and wider universals. This kind of abstraction whereby the mind rises above simple animal knowledge of a singular, perceived by the sense of here and now, hic et nunc, as he writes, and which in reality begins with more general and undetermined notions, is at the root of all human knowing. It is common to all sciences. So, for example, you sort of consider Peter and Paul as individual people, and then you get man from them. And then you sort of examine man as a whole through many Peters and many Pauls, and then you get animal from that, or you get a rational animal, and then you're sort of considering other beings in the world, such as cats and dogs, and then you get catness and dogness through specific cats and dogs, and then for both of them you get animal, and then you compare that with rational animal, then you only get animal, and then you also separate the rational from that. So you consider rationality in itself and animality in itself. So every turn of knowledge, through the more examination of the physical world and the contingent particular things that are in it, you proceed to wider and wider circles of universals considerations, and then you approach the more immaterial realm, the third degree of abstraction. So you can sort of see the reason why he puts this in degrees, because we naturally start with the first degree, sort of proceed to the second degree, and then finally we can proceed to the third, because this is the natural way human knowledge and consideration of things works.
And this is the point that he brings up later, as the role of the senses is that once even metaphysics sort of has its principles to work with, and Aristotle understood metaphysics through understanding things. You can't, the mind cannot grasp substance or form or matter or any of these things before it sees them in things, right? Which is the reason that God is so incomprehensible to us, is that there is no tangible connection that we can make. We can only sort of make him know him. I don't want to say analogically, but as he says, there's things that exist only immaterially, and so those we have to work a lot harder at, versus things that are immaterial but can exist in things. But so I'm rambling too much. We know those things first in what we see them in. We know substance because we see substances.
Yes. And he actually has a small paragraph sort of summarizing the way this thing works. So I'll read that instead of giving my own. If a figure of speech can be permitted here, let us say that the work of the intellect can be compared to an immaterial magic. From the flux of singular and contingent things as given to the apprehension of the sense, a first glance of the intellect reveals the world of corporeal substances and their properties. That's the first degree, the first glance. A second glance reveals quite another universe, the ideal world of the extended number. Second degree, Mathematica. A third glance discloses still another, wholly different universe, the world of being as being, and all the transcendental perfections common to spirits and bodies, wherein we can attain purely spiritual realities and the very principle of all reality as in a mirror. And that's how he sort of summarized it, how the work of the intellect is, how it proceeds forth to higher and higher degrees, and how it attains more and more knowledge.
Mm-hmm. All right, is it time for the diagram?
Let me see. Do I have any more notes? Oh no, it's like 1 page and a half away. So
Yeah.
unless you want to talk about point 13, we can go on to the table of sciences.
Yeah. So let me try and set this up a little bit while you bring it up. So Maritain wants to sort of explain his view of the sciences. That's going to set up his critical realist view and the proper role of these different degrees of abstraction in terms of our intellect and our understanding in science and philosophy, and goes to quite some detail over several pages trying to flesh this out. But because he is a teacher first and foremost, he has a helpful visual aid to describe this relationship, which makes things much more clear. Let me see if I can turn this on now. So this is what he presents as his table of science. Bulge and I discussed this in some detail, and I think you said you just sort of you looked at it once, gave up on it, and just read his description.
I mean, I looked at the arrows over. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see my cursor?
We can, yes.
Or no? Okay, so I sort of looked at these moderns' attraction towards mathematics and ancients' attraction towards metaphysics, and I looked at the second degree, and then the first and third are on the other side, and then I sort of gave up and just read his explanation, which makes way more sense than this table.
So I think you've commented previously. He has another. I can't remember the name of it, but there's ways of doing God or some such. But he frequently decides that he needs to add tables or figures to his discussion, and they never seem to be helpful.
Yeah, they only confuse the reader. I think I took a week to understand the table in Ways of Knowing God. Eventually, I understood it, and I was like, okay, this is sort of helpful now that I understand it, as a mnemonic device for sort of picturing the first cause. Aquinas's first way of knowing God, because that's what that table in that book is for. And so I can sort of actually understand it, because he's separating the a series in time from a hierarchical series, and he sort of puts one above the other, and I can sort of picture it. And in time, every act that needs to be supported in itself by something that is pure act, or else it won't be supported because it's purely contingent, and so on. And I sort of understand it, but you need to read way more deeply into act and potency distinction than he goes into that book, which is just a great way of doing diagrams.
And that's sort of where I ended on this one, is reading his extensive discussion of what's in the figure. I probably can't do it now, but at the time I could sort of make sense of what was in there. But the actual figure itself didn't aid any of my understanding, as best I could tell.
Okay, so you can sort of make sense of it in chunks. I cannot make sense of it as a whole. which is interesting to me. But in chunks, for example, if you can see my cursor, this part here on the right, where he sort of classifies science and philosophy, you can, if you just consider that and ignore the rest, that is actually a pretty good summary of what we've been saying so far. What he does go into in his explanation of his table is what he is classifying as physical mathematics as ciencia, what does he call it? Essentially mediating science. That is what mediates the empirical with the mathematical, because, you know, physics, when considered as with maths, as modern physics very much is, it's actually a great discovery because we can very much explain regularities in nature way better than we could in Aristotle's day with mere words. I mean, try describing a cubic or quadratic equation with words, with like x to the power of 4 plus 7x to the power of 3 plus 24x to the power of 2 plus x plus k plus 7k. K being an unknown quantity.
Sure.
Try describing that with pure words and saying what that is and what each x is, and then using that to resolve an equation and find out what the x is, and so on and so forth. Because that's what people really had to work with before modern mathematical notation. And before Descartes, you really didn't have a Cartesian graph, and so you were out of luck when you were trying to describe geometrical figures and assign equations to it.
And it's so interesting if you can actually read some of the writing around that time, even as they started to develop it. Like if you read Newton in the Principia Naturalis, he's still trying to do that. Like they have the mathematical tools, but they are still trying to write these things out. And as a modern, it is impossible to read because they will take a paragraph and a half to do what like a sufficiently advanced high schooler would just write down as a single equation, as in one line, and be like, "Yep, I get that."
Yes, exactly. I actually had a math and physics teacher once told me, if you're interested in reading the Principia, do not read the Principia. There's like modern rewritings of it. You just read those because you're going to get stuck really quickly. But yes, this is actually really helpful to understand. Okay, I can actually picture, instead of like trying to memorize his explanations or, I sort of forgot his explanation, I can just go to this graph and I can consider this. Mm-hmm. And, going by the numbers, I can look at first degree, second degree, and third degree. I cannot. And the second degree, he says that he separates it because it's a wholly different kind of degree. It's only considering quantity in a specific sense, and it's not actually resolved in sensible being or resolved in being as being, and that's why he's separating it. But I don't know what that means in this case. Why is it next to the chart of the hierarchy of sciences and philosophy? I don't know. What is this in the center? I don't know. That's about as far as I can go with this first diagram. He has a few others in this chapter.
They're a little bit simpler, but so something I wanted to focus on a bit. I wanted to get your feeling of this, because this is something that I think the diagram at least might not explain well, but we can show it very well. Is you've got physica there on the left, and it splits down into empirical science. There's an arrow going down, empirical science at the bottom, and what he calls philosophy of nature up at the top. Mm-hmm. And again, going back to what physica fundamentally is, and this is this understanding, this abstraction of being as changeable being.
Mm-hmm. He calls it sensible being here.
Sensible being, yes.
But sensible being is naturally changeable. He doesn't specify this in this chapter, but that's one of the reasons God can't be material, because sensible being is always subject to change and is therefore a changeable being.
Yeah, I should be cautious and stick to his terminology, but like you said, they're the same thing.
Yes, they're interchangeable if you understand what he's talking about.
Right. But something I find is interesting is what he has in philosophy and philosophy of nature is still part of physica. And the philosophy of nature he describes is actually trying to ontologically understand what things are. So this would be the essence of physical things, is a philosophy of nature, but it's also a part of physica. And it's not a part of physica that we really do anymore. Like you said, it's this sort of physico-mathematical approach to a lot of the pure sciences has gotten rid of philosophy of nature as an idea.
He talks about this.
There's a good footnote I can't, go ahead. I'm going to look for the footnote.
You can try to find the footnote. So he talks about this. He actually, he doesn't immediately rail against it, as I would expect many more, I'd expect Fraser, for example, someone like Edward Fraser, to immediately start railing against this and then make a quick digression and say, actually, this is actually really useful for classifying regularities in nature. But, I need to front load these problems so you understand because you're steeped in this. I don't know if things were slightly different in the 30s, but he starts out with a quick apologia saying this is actually an incredible discovery by Descartes and other mathematicians and scientists around the 15th, 16th century, because it allows us to classify regularities in nature better than we ever could before, and to, comprehend them through the use of mathematics better than anyone else before this time period really could, and describe them and teach them better. But the problem is that people have sort of run away with it and put it and replaced it as philosophy of nature, and even sometimes as metaphysics itself. But there are several obvious problems with it. We barely need to go on into this because it's so obvious. But for example, if whenever you're doing a method such as a physical mathematical method, you sort of need something to justify that method. You have an implicit metaphysics behind that. You have an implicit epistemology and an implicit theory of mind, and you sort of can't really describe the mind in mathematical terms. I mean, you can try, and certain attempts have been made, especially in more recent neuroscience, but it all ends up not really even convincing. You sort of end up with the mind is a machine learning AI analogy, which they don't even say is an analogy. They just say, the mind is a machine learn is just a meat AI,
right,
with machine learning technology.
It's a fleshy computer is the term I've heard.
Yes, you're a meat computer.
Yeah, and it's the, I think it's the loss of this distinction, and this is what he's trying to do with this arrow, with the ancients being attracted towards metaphysics and moderns attraction towards mathematics, is the modern physics in particular, modern science, gets to the physical mathematics and tries to go from that to create a philosophy of nature, and it does it very, very poorly because it doesn't have any kind of principles to try and understand essence. In a lot of cases, it denies essence, right? If you don't really understanding what a mind is or what the human soul is, then you end up saying these sort of stupid positivist things like, okay, yeah, the mind is just a really fancy, complicated artificial intelligence network.
Yes,
but so
and you get to the point where nominalism with physical mathematical things, with physical mathematical relations, barely even functions, if at all, because you sort of get, okay, what are we even quantifying in this equation at all? If it's purely nominal, if it's just a name and not even something which we can abstract from in the existing mind.
And it's so crazy how much that question sort of gets asked and ignored in modern science. Is there's this sort of shut up and compute mindset that, okay, we can get an answer. It agrees
shut up
with
and compute.
So like we've made, and this is progress despite not actually understanding what he would, this is explanatory science. The ultimate goal of science is to know essences, and you can't ever really get away from essences, but they do it. They implicitly try to. And that's why you end up having an understanding that is just completely nonsense. But so here's the thing that I wanted to ask about, what your thoughts on.
Yep.
Because we have a philosophy of nature that is not itself metaphysics, right? We are understanding the essence of physical things. But so my question, or what I want to pose to you, is you mentioned an article last time where someone was trying to decide if some kind of sea creature or plankton or something like that was a substance or not.
Yes, siphonophores. It was an article by David Oderberg, who Edward Fraser heartily recommends every chance he gets on his Twitter. So that means he's actually very good. Real Essentialism is his treatise. He is, by his name, I assume he is a Catholic convert from a Jewish family. But I know he is a Catholic convert, or at least an Anglican, because he does call Thomas Aquinas Saint Aquinas,
right?
And he quotes Paul as the apostle in one of his other papers. But yes, it was it was trying to classify metaphysically what a siphonophore is. Is it a colony of animals, as many scientists have said, or is it one animal, or as many other scientists such as Stephen Jay Gould and others have classified, is it something in between a colony and an animal? And he objects to that on metaphysical principles, saying that makes no sense. that doesn't exist. That's nonsense. We need to actually resolve this question. And he weighs into that it is one animal by examining each of its parts, concluding whether it can actually be an independent animal working in a colony-like fashion, or whether it is just a part, a function towards a specific thing.
So here's the excellent summary. Here's the question I want to raise to you, because you keep referring to that as metaphysical. And I would argue, based on at least by Maritain's understanding of these degrees of abstraction, is that he's not doing metaphysics. He is doing physics. He is firmly lodged in physica. He's in the philosophy of nature. He's not doing empirical physics.
Yes.
But it is very much that distinction of what is the substance, or which of these things is a substance? Is it one substance? Is it many substances? Is it a part of a substance? Is not itself a metaphysical question. It is very much a question for physics, properly understood. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree that it's a philosophy of nature question. Right. I would say that it needs the metaphysical principles. And so David Oderberg, who probably has a different classification system than Maritain, calls it a metaphysical because he's trying to say, what is the real substance of this creature? Is it one? Is it many? Is essentially what he's trying to say.
Yeah, so this is a question for physics, properly speaking, because it's the essence of a changeable thing, which is the object of physics.
But it's not what but because David Oderberg is a modern analytical philosopher who happens to be a scholastic and an Aristotelian, he sort of is using modern terminology.
Sure.
But I would agree with you. By Maritain's categories, which I think are more useful for detailed study, it would be philosophy of nature, and it would not be metaphysics as such. Metaphysics would be arguing, okay, what is the world of forms? Does the world of forms exist? How does it work? Is it a divine intellect, or is it just a different world? Does the divine intellect exist? Is there such a thing as an unmoved mover? So essentially, the debates between an agnostic like Graham Oppie and Edward Fazer, a Catholic metaphysician, about the existence of God, and the ontological argument and the unmoved mover argument, and whether we can conclude certain metaphysical points about each of these arguments, or whether they're insufficient, that would be metaphysics as such. Everything else would be the philosophy of nature using metaphysics as a crutch, which it needs, which Maritain argues.
You need metaphysics to even say what a substance is per se.
Yes, of course. And
then to determine what particular things are substances would be physics using that metaphysical insight. But I just think that's very interesting, because I think that's something that confuses a lot. Because I think Maritain is right in this classification, there is a difference between looking at the essences of physical beings and looking at being as such. So that even if you're talking about essences, even if you're talking about very philosophical ideas, is this a substance? Is this what is even the question, what is a man? What is a rational animal? The rational part kind of screws with it a little bit because our rationality is immaterial. But these are properly questions for physica. And physics or biology or whatever proper science to them. Again, we've lost that in the modern era. The modern sort of stop that you get to this mathematics level and you describe things phenomenologically, and then you sort of give up on saying what essences are, even that they exist, because like you said, they become nominalists, they become positivists.
For viewers, I can pose this. I can actually pose two questions. One of which is metaphysics as such, the other which is philosophy of nature, using this siphonophore study as sort of an example. Keep it in mind. So metaphysical question would be, what is substance? Does it exist? The philosophy of nature question would be, once you settle that, what kind of substance is this? What are the categories of substance to which this applies, and so on, to which this particular thing in the world applies, that is.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that was I wanted to just put that out there, because again, I think yeah, and maybe I don't know how relevant it actually is, but I'm a pedant for this kind of thing, that we properly distinguish what abstraction we are using. Because like I said, if you're trying to do science, or if in this broader sense, there is a relationship between physical phenomena and their essence, right? That's how we know. It's
important to see if we agree or disagree with Maritain's classification of philosophy of nature as distinct from metaphysics.
And I think in terms of describe what the role of empiricism is. Empiricism can do a lot more to describe philosophy of nature than it can metaphysics, right? But we get very, very fundamental things from empirical science to talk about metaphysics, right? We see things exist, change exists, substances exist, and the metaphysics sort of takes off on its own. But the sort of more specialized insights of empirical science tell us about their nature, right? Einstein's theory of relativity tells us something about the nature of moving bodies.
I mean, yeah, in that specific paper which I referenced, Siphonophore's a metaphysical case study. Look it up if you want, by David Oderberg. He sort of goes in very deeply into the science of the function of each siphonophore part. Is it an animal? Can it be an animal? What do we consider an animal? What are the scientific classifications for it? What are the metaphysical warranties for what animality constitutes? And there's a lot of empirical study involved. He cites a lot of empirical studies in siphonophores to prove his point. So in that case, of course, it would be philosophy of nature as such instead of metaphysics as such.
And this is something that sort of that I disagree with Maritain a little bit. He gets into this later because he's very content to say, okay, like the what he would call the observational sciences have moved in this physical mathematical direction. We can leave them to it. It sort of frees up other things or frees up metaphysics, because the historical tradition would be very much like we talked about with Oderberg, is people would try and scientists would use empiricism to try and discover natures. Right. The original name for a lot of these things was natural philosophy.
Yes.
Right. It was very much a philosophical discipline. And I think it is a real loss for science and for understanding that we've lost this, that we've tried that we don't do more of the things that Oderberg is doing, that there isn't more effort to try and derive philosophical truths. I say philosophical, not metaphysical truths, physical truths about essence, from the empirical, instead of just leaving the empirical as sort of these mathematical relationships that we don't end up doing much with. And Maritain's very happy with that state of affairs, and I'm not. I think there needs to be a lot more Oderberg even in physics.
Yes,
in modern
Oderberg
physics.
is principally Phaser is more of a physics guy. If you read Aristotle's Revenge, he's very much more focused on physics. Brian Davies, who another scholastic and Catholic, is focused in chemistry, and Oderberg is I think by profession a bioethicist, a professor of bioethics. But so he's very much focused in biology. But Maritain does have a slight concession to this, I suppose, if we can call it that, where he calls every higher discipline is regulative with respect to its inferiors. So he's not at all afraid of calling science as science inferior to metaphysics. Continuing, he says, since metaphysics considers the highest reasons for being, it will, as a result, be the regulating science par excellence. But mathematics is also a deductive science, a science of the propter quid, the proper thing itself. Quid, I think, would be thing. It will also tend to rule the lower sections of knowing, if not to encroach upon metaphysics itself. We thus understand the struggle for dominion so often engaged in by these two sciences in the course of history. So that actually, I think, is a slight reply to your criticism of him, and also to the other question you had about whether he classifies all of these as sciences. It seems that he does actually classify both metaphysics and mathematics as sciences in themselves.
And that just makes his figure even more confusing, because on the far right there, he has philosophy and science as distinct things.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I can't defend him on that one.
The figure is just so unhelpful. Oh my
I
goodness.
think he's using science equivocally, and that means, maybe it's not even analogically. He is using it equivocally, and I don't equivocally, at least in Portuguese. If I say equivocal, which is the Portuguese translation of it, it means a mistake. You're using the word in the wrong sense. So I don't mean that, but he is using the word in two different senses here. Yes. He is using science as something which as scientia, and science as what is terminologically classified as science in the modern world.
Which does, this is why he can be confusing. And again, I'm going to blame even though he credits the translation as being fantastic, I'm going to say it works better in the original French. Although, can you imagine looking at this diagram in French?
I cannot. The translation in the written parts, at least, is very good.
It's tongue in cheek when I blame the translation, yes. But when there are word uses like that require some specificity, and it seems to be lacking them. Okay. We need to get moving, or we're gonna be going like 3 hours in this thing. Any other comments you have on related to his table of science, or we want to move on to science and philosophy?
First diagram, no. I have the other diagrams here. Second one, as you can see here. Tell me when you want to get to it. I'll stop sharing if you.
Yeah, let me go ahead. I can switch that off for you.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing the screen then. Okay.
Perfect.
What's the next part you want to get into?
So the next major area is science and philosophy. It's section 3 of this chapter. So starting with paragraph 15. Let
me try and get to it.
Let's see. Oh, and then he gets his we can, if you have anything there, but also we can talk about his clarification on when he starts talking about facts.
Oh, I do actually have something on facts, but if you want, but you should probably
let's go there. Let's go and go on to facts.
Is there anything interesting? I'm trying to skim through it if there's, because I didn't take. Okay, so the only thing which I did highlight in this was again another instance of how he describes the mind works in terms of knowledge. So it's the last sentence before point 16, if you can see it. For the mind will always and necessarily raise questions of a higher order and strive to penetrate into the purely intelligible being the purely immaterial, as he says earlier. So I'll actually read the whole paragraph because it might make more sense for viewers, because I highlighted this for myself. So truth to tell, scientific explanations do not reveal the very being of things, since they explain only proximate causes, or even that kind of formal cause, which is the conformity of phenomena to mathematical law, and such more or less arbitrarily constructed entities fashioned as a support for this type of law. They can never satisfy the mind, for the mind will always and necessarily raise questions of a higher order and strive to penetrate into the purely intelligible. So there is a slight criticism of him that one can make here, is that if one considers this as a psychological tendency, we can very easily say this is not true, in the sense that many people are actually very much satisfied with the physical mathematical and are content to never move beyond it at all. In fact, the evidence is all around us today, and he sort of criticizes this later. So he's sort of saying that, they can't satisfy. So you can sort of we have to take it in another sense to make sense of what he's saying, that it can never satisfy the mind fully. You're always going to end up with other questions that you can't answer, and you're just going to have to shrug your shoulders, I think, is what he's trying to say here.
So I would argue a little bit as that as much as moderns are content to rely on the mathematical, they do try and make up ontologies still. Like, I mean, and this is why a lot of these sort of famous paradoxes, when you talk about Schrodinger's cat, or when you'll have these very bizarre arguments about people about whether or not time exists. I remember, I think it was Caleb posted the poll about what is it, type A and type B time, whether or not time is a real thing or phenomenological or whatever, is that people do try and build ontologies and build these philosophies of natures and this metaphysics out of the Physica Mathematica. They just do a really bad job, but they still ask for those explanations. They just want they want equations to give them those explanations, and and equations do a very poor job of explaining things. Because they don't have they lack most of the causes. Like they have formal causality, but they don't have material causality. They don't have efficient causality. They certainly don't have final causality. And so you have a very messed up kind.
Actually, you're correct. I sort of interpreted him wrongly. I sort of assumed that he was saying that the mind would try to penetrate, would on its own with these questions go into the immaterial. But what he's really saying is that it will necessarily raise questions of a higher order. And that's just true. If the mind, you're going to end up with questions of a higher order, you're usually, if you just rely on the physical mathematical, end up with nonsense. And so you can sort of say that is a striving to penetrate into the purely intelligible, but because of some psychological block, the modern mind has a habit of not doing such.
And I think this also ties in nicely, again, assuming sort of a well-ordered intellect, to what he goes into in chapter 1, talking about the poverty of metaphysics, is that the eventually those higher order questions become metaphysical and become foundational in the sense of striving to know ultimately what made us. And we keep trying those harder questions, and at some point metaphysics fails to do that. And this will hopefully, I'm excited to get to it, prompt sort of part 2, where he talks about revelatory knowledge and supra rational knowledge, because those are even higher order than metaphysical questions, right? But I call it base metaphysics can't answer all of the own questions that it poses, right? It can't ultimately tell us everything that we would like to know. and so we have to strive for higher order things. And this is one could argue in a more cynical way that this is what gives rise to religion, is that we metaphysics sort of tells us what it can and demands higher level questions that it can't answer. And then so, and someone would say, religion gets created to answer those questions. A good Catholic would say, we have divine revelation to help us answer these questions. But that it is
one can very easily say that without the divine revelation, pagan religions, such as, even Hinduism, which certain thinkers such as what's his name, Adi Shankara, the creator of the Advaita Vedanta sect of Hinduism, did actually reach the conclusion that the being itself, the Godhead, is triune. It is one and free. It is, I believe, Atman, Krishna, and Brahman are one soul wearing three masks, is what he says in his commentaries of the Bhagavad Gita. So there is, and then, you can sort of, say that if you really want to go with this, that other religions or many religions do actually show this striving to penetrate into the purely intelligible. And maybe even, I think St. Aquinas has some comment where he says, God will not let people perish without hearing the gospel, to the extent that he will even use angels to announce it to a single man in an island who has never heard of it before, if necessary for his salvation. So you can sort of also say that in a sense, which makes sense.
Sure.
But you do need some form of revelatory knowledge to even get to that conclusion about the unmoved mover, who we call God.
Right. Oh, this is fun. All right. So what do you have next? Do you want to get on to facts? Again, I don't want to rush us too much, but I also I don't want us to drag on too long if we're
because there's a lot of parts which sort of I think the next part, point 16, he sort of is clarifying stuff that he already said. If I remember correctly, I didn't highlight anything in point 16. I only started highlighting again in point 17. And then, which includes which is very near to point 18, because 17 is very short, where he goes on into the clarifications on the notion of fact.
So you said you had a point on fact that you wanted to bring up?
So just before, I have two underlines. There is where he's sort of clarifying, where I've already talked about this, but I'll just read this because this is two sentences. It's the beginning and end of the last paragraph of point 17. There is, to be sure, a great material dependence of philosophy on the sciences. In the first place, within the hierarchy of knowledges, philosophy is like culminating point, one that consequently comes last pedagogically. And then the last sentence, to imagine that philosophical doctrines have to be changed with every scientific revolution would be as absurd as to think that the soul is transformed with every change of diet. Which I think is a good analogy and a good reductio ad absurdum of doctrines which say otherwise.
No, I think.
So that's all that I had highlighted. I've already mentioned this earlier too.
It's a nice refutation of Kuhn's ideas, is that they're, and which should be fairly obvious, is there is something that is sustained knowledge-wise even through these revolutions in our understanding. Is there are still first principles, there are still fundamental things that we do know to be true, and even if we haven't made them explicit, that you can have conclusions that were not well justified, that you sort of took as given, and then they can be either further specified or better refined or modified, but you still have those philosophical truths. And that includes the philosophy of nature, right? If we've correctly deduced the nature of something, new empirical data isn't going to change that, right? We're not going to have new empirical data show us that man is in fact not a rational animal, right? There's no amount of empiricism that's going to show that, because it's been properly deduced from the things that we've seen, and we have a proper understanding of that philosophical knowledge
from proper experience itself. You can't really falsify proper experience itself of nature with other experience of nature. It's sort of a contradiction in terms, even.
Oh, and this slightly related. There's another point I wanted to. This is probably just petty of me, but I wanted to go back to the conversation that I was having with our mutual friend, who was insisting that physical knowledge was by its nature inductive. And I want to, my point being, like we were talking about with this philosophy of nature, is properly understood philosophy of nature, which is still part of physica, is deductive, right? We are still deducing properly that man is a rational animal. This is not an inductive proof that we make, that we haven't, we don't see 50 men and see they're rational and then induce and determine that number 51 is also going to be rational. We understand deductively something about the nature of essences, or the nature of
Yes,
man, his
of
essence.
what it is to be a man.
Yes.
And then we
And
can say that everything that conforms to the type man is therefore a rational animal.
Right. And this is necessarily true and deductively true. So take that person that probably isn't listening to this, maybe he will, but that I was arguing with previously.
I'll send it to him. He's not on Twitter right now, but I'll send it to him either way. I'll find some way to do it.
Oh well, it's fine.
I'll bother another mutual friend to see if he can do it. I'll clip this.
I feel so petty. Please move on.
Want to move on then?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So clarifications on the notions of fact. So the only thing I've highlighted of this entire section, so then you'll need to help me through it, is his very first definition of what is a fact. So I'll just read it. It's 2 sentences. What then is a fact? It is a well-established existential truth. A certain connection in the objects of our concepts exists in the real. That very fact implies that this existence confronts a mind. And then he goes on to clarify what this means for the mind itself, which is actually a very interesting discussion. Do you want me to just read the rest of this?
If you want to finish the paragraph, sure.
Sure, that very fact that something is a well-established existential truth and exists in connection in the objects of our concepts and exists in the real, so there's a connection between those, implies that this existence confronts a mind, the existence itself, something which is in being, confronts a mind which can grasp therein those objects. So there is an object out there, then there is a mind that can somehow, through some mechanism, grasp these objects. A fact engaging human knowledge is not created by the human mind. A stone is not given to a stone. A fact is given, but it is given to someone, and if it is given, it is received. A stone is not given to a stone. A fact is given to a mind. That is to say, it is discerned and judged. To conceive it as a pure and simple copy of the external real, devoid of any discrimination, is a deceptive simplification due to the unconscious materialism of the imagination. So if you're not aware, this is essentially him railing against Hume's idea of empirical knowledge. Hume and Locke, really. Mm-hmm. Maybe even more Locke, although that might be because of actually read Locke and not really engaged with Hume.
Not Hume, yep.
Yeah, wherein very much, the imagination and intellect are the same thing for human Locke. So I'll just say Locke's because I don't want to badmouth Hume, but Phaser and others say Hume copies the same formula, where the imagination and intellect is the same thing, and therefore everything the intellect receives is essentially a phantasm of the senses in the imagination. So it's this pure and simple carbon copy of the senses into the imagination. But you can sort of say that Maritain saying that theory of mind in epistemology is completely wrong. Mm-hmm. It is something which exists in the real, and then the mind apprehends this and forms a connection with it in a concept, and then engages with degrees of abstraction to it, which is implicit here, but he doesn't specify.
Sure. And just to clarify a little bit for those who aren't familiar with this, for the Aristotelian idea, and I think Maritain certainly subscribes to this, I think both you and I would as well, is that the imagination is what puts us in contact with specific knowledge. So it's the images that you get from sense awareness, so things that you see, things that you hear, whereas the intellect puts us in contact with general knowledge. It's how we know ideas, or I should say, ideas are the object by which we know things in general. Mm-hmm. So even a higher mere animal would have an imagination, in as much as he can handle his sense knowledge. A mere animal by definition would not have an intellect because he doesn't know generals. He doesn't know essences.
Exactly.
Hopefully that clarifies.
Yeah, there's further divisions of the intellect. Anscombe has a few famous papers actually, sort of rebutting David Hume's theory of causation, which is essentially that causation is pure probability based on empirical observation, as sort of insane on its face from theory of mind point of view, because that's not how the intellect works, because you can't actually you can maybe imagine something coming into being without a cause, but then how does that thing come into being? Is it being teleported or is it being created? And if it's being created, that then is part of its essence, and so forth and so on. If that's part of its essence, then if that's causing it to appear in middle of nowhere, and that's part of the intellect. The imagination can just imagine a rabbit popping up on your table, but the intellect, if it goes deeper and questions these things, can't. it sort of needs to understand what these things are and what is happening. It's a
Mhm.
more the imagination is essentially is closer to the phantasms in your mind, sort of just putting mental pictures up. The intellect needs to understand and conceive properly of these mental pictures, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it needs to understand causation and essence, essentially. Like, right, it's what's grasping essence. It's I really it's shocking to me that these sorts of, I think, very articulate, very well thought out takedowns of what I would essentially call Cartesian idealism, right? And I think this
Mm-hmm.
is all the essence of a lot of these of Humean or Kantian thought, just get eviscerated, I think, so effectively by people that can actually express scholastic or Aristotelian Thomistic views effectively, that they still are sort of the dominating force philosophically in the world is mind-boggling to me, because we have such a more clear and correct view that can effectively eviscerate them and existed well before them, and yet is not the common understanding in the world. Drives me a little bit crazy.
Yeah, Kant is a more difficult animal to tackle because he purposefully, his critical philosophy, his critiques are both a response to Hume and Descartes and Leibniz. So it's between empiricism and rationalism, and he's purposefully threading a middle ground between what he sees as the two possible extremes in philosophy, because to him that was basically philosophy. It was
Right.
everything from the 1500s on. And so he's a more complex animal to tackle in this sense, because he sort of has more interesting observations about the mind and the intellect than Descartes and Hume do. But he sort of gets away from himself very, very early on and very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So what else do you have on this? Because there's plenty else which I didn't highlight because I just sort of read through and forgot to.
The one other thing I want to mention is the first line of point 19, where it says, the error of the idealists is at the same time to challenge the primordial value of sense intuition. In one way or another, every existential apprehension originates in this intuition, even when the fact in question transcends the whole order of the empirical and the sensible. And I love this because I think it's
it's
again,
very good.
When I eventually actually get around to writing on materialism, it's going to be contrasted to idealism, because the people we've been talking about are very much fundamentally philosophical idealists. There is this Cartesian notion about the trustworthiness of the senses and our ability to receive knowledge through the senses. Again, I think probably related to this imagination intellect distinction, but that we do have these well-established truths. There are facts that are given to our mind through our sense knowledge, and that's the way that we have to start deriving principles from which we can start doing metaphysics. Right? I think you mentioned the quote before about the absurdity of trying to base your philosophy on doubt, which is where you end up if you're going to be an idealist fundamentally.
Yes. Yeah, the idealists are. I don't know how if he's using this to refer to Descartes, or if he's specifically targeting the German and then English idealists of this time. Because I know there was a famous English idealist who another Catholic philosopher, Peter Geach, who was a contemporary of Maritain, loves to spar with. What's his name? Ellis MacTaggart, John MacTaggart, something like that. He has MacTaggart twice in his name. I'll just call him MacTaggart then. He's the most famous English Hegelian, and he's very much an idealist. So I don't know if he's targeting for both challenge the primordial value of sense intuition, because idealists sort of think that our necessary ideas condition the world that as we perceive them, and therefore we only need to sort of pay attention to the a priori synthetic and then move on from there. If I can be allowed to make such a crude caricature of them, because they write, Maritain is already a relatively difficult read by the way he writes. The German Hegelians and idealists are by far worse. If you've ever attempted to read Phenomenology of the Spirit, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, good luck if you ever attempt to. But yes, he sort of Maritain gives a very interesting counterexample here, where it sort of sums up if you're confused by the previous point about the value of sense intuition towards immaterial and therefore the real nature of things, that the same is true of experience of our own existence, An experience, though it is spiritual, not empirical, supposes a reflection on our own acts, which are usually empirical, though an act of thinking is not. This is true also of our knowledge of God's existence, which is established from visible things. This is something that not Aristotle, sorry, although Aristotle does do this for the unmoved mover argument, but Aquinas does. He always proceeds from the visible towards the invisible. He very much is not a he doesn't proceed from a priori synthetic truths to then establish that therefore God exists. He's not engaging in an ontological argument. That is, from the very fact that we as thinking, perceiving beings exist, as minds exist, therefore God exists, which is something that has a rich and interesting tradition. They're all very interesting arguments. They get quite beyond me when they get into modal logic.
Sure.
That's not the Thomistic way of doing things.
Right. And this is probably too much of a tangent, but it's interesting to know that even when you do try and start from the existence of a mind, right? I mean, this is what I would call fundamentally Cartesian. It's this: I think, therefore I am. As you have your thinking being as your sort of first a priori knowledge. But the knowledge of the self isn't fundamental, right? Even that through sense knowledge, right? There has to be this tabula rasa idea, is that we are blank slates. We don't have ideas innately. We receive sense knowledge, and from that we can start to formulate ideas. So we don't even know that we exist. We don't know ourselves until we recognize that there's a knower that's knowing physical things. There's someone that knows sense things out there. Someone saw a flower. Someone saw a tree. And then you sort of work back and go, oh, that's me. There's a mind there that knows those things. But even that fundamental thing, right? So Descartes starting from I think is not fundamentally correct. He senses first, and then he's able to reflect on that sense knowledge, and from that to establish the existence of his mind. I would say that's not even an a priori truth.
Yes, that's actually the intro I mentioned before, that quote from Olavo de Carvalho, the Brazilian philosopher, that there are interesting observations in modern philosophy, whereas you sometimes have to throw away you sometimes have to throw away the bathwater, but try and save the baby if you can. Where in phenomena, especially this really starts with Hegel, is that phenomenon, whereas modern philosophy starts recognizing that, wait a minute, you only really realize that you have a mind and what you are in relation to the world, in interacting with the world. Because if you never interact with another human, with another rational animal, how can you're just in the wild, you might not ever even realize that you're a rational animal. I mean, you will engage in rational acts. You will economize even, you'll be Robinson Crusoe, but you might never even reflect on that aspect, because you'll always be engaging with other animals on the same level as an animal. It's essentially a technical problem, as Hoppe puts it, not as an intersubjective problem, whereas this is another rational animal with their own point of view. This is someone to whom I am a you, and this is someone who is a you to my I. There is an I-you relationship therefore established, and therefore that gives rise to morals, codes of conduct, politeness, so on and so forth. That is an interesting observation that really does start with Hegel and really develops with the phenomenologists of the 20th century, Husserl, Heidegger, and interestingly enough, St. Edith Stein in the 20th century. But that is an actually very important observation that we can sort of brag that the Aristotelians got there first, if we really want to. St. Edith Stein certainly thought so. She dedicated her life's project to when she became a nun, to proving that you can get from phenomenology to Aristotelian Thomistic principles, and vice versa. You can get from Aristotelian Thomistic principles to all the correct concepts established by phenomenology.
I need to read more Edith Stein. Should we move on to structure and methods of the principal kinds of knowledge? We can get back to our figures again if you want to.
From now on, I have no more notes except the figures. So you take it away. I'll just follow your lead.
I mean, typically these tend to be pretty self-explanatory. Can you share again so I can?
Yes, of course.
Those up.
Present, share screen, window. Where is my notebook? Okay.
So while these are, I think, probably more intelligible than figure one, I actually found these even less helpful because there's not a whole lot to them. So what he's doing here is going through and trying to show the structure of different kinds of knowledge. So he talks about an est and quid est. So the two principal kinds of questions. I'll read the quote here. Must be kept in mind that every science has to answer two questions. First, the question an est, whether the thing exists, and then the question quid est, what is its nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is the first establishing that its existence and then its essence.
Yes. It's a very basic diagram, which I don't even know what the squiggly line is. I'm gonna be honest. I actually don't know. I don't know. Maybe you can explain it better. But it's actually intelligible as a diagram. I think maybe his diagrams are his way to prove that immaterial things are more intelligible than material things. I don't know. Maybe that's how he's doing it pedagogically.
The diagrams are material and unintelligible. Therefore, his description must be perfect.
Yeah, I don't know. When you consider the concepts of his words and his propositions, you understand them. But when you consider them as a visualized graph, as a diagram, then you're just lost.
So the idea here with mathematics is as we mentioned, is mathematics is abstracted from the physical, from the real, right? So we have physical facts. We observe quantity in things. We see that there are four or something. We see that something is round. We see that something has three sides, whatever. We abstract that away to see the thing that exists, right? Triangleness is a property of things, that it exists in nature. Three is a property that exists in combinations of things. There are holes. There's a hole with parts, right? Your hand can have 5 different fingers on it. You get this. You can abstract 5 from looking at your hand like that, and that's against the store an est. And then from there, all mathematics does is it can stay at that level of abstraction. It doesn't really need to make contact back down with the physical. It can be informed by the physical. I think that's what the squiggle is showing us, is we can sort of make contact again with the physical. But mathematics, well, as soon as it has its concepts and sees that they exist, it can just go off to the races, right? You can do analytical continuations and you can discover imaginary numbers.
Yes, exactly. I was also going to use that example, imaginary numbers.
Right. Or more complex algebras and group theories and these things that we no longer see the connection to the sensible, but it's there indirectly, right? As soon as we sort of have our postulates, we write down our axioms, we can just go from there, and we no longer need to make contact with the sensible.
Logic, which I think he would include in mathematics, just the study of logic, just something like sentential and propositional logic. You can sort of run away. You can sort of make nonsense statements and declare if they're valid or invalid, and then not care if they're sound, which would mean they connect to reality or not, which would need empirical testing. You can sort of say they're valid or invalid given this, and you can sort of, with very such as let's make a simple syllogism. The moon is made of cheese. The only type of cheese in the world is X, therefore the moon is made of X. Right. Let's say X is camembert or something.
Yeah, right.
Stuff like that. And that is a valid syllogism. It's not sound, because then you need to make contact with the sensible, but it is valid. It makes logical sense. And you can sort of get with extremely complex propositional sentences just on this, without caring a whit as to whether it's sound or not. And then, ideally, you'd go back to the realm of the sensible and actually use that to understand the sensible better and make sense of what you're observing, but with that apparatus that you can sort of do on your own without paying attention to the sensible.
And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about mathematics being formal or having only formal cause, right? Like you can have formally valid logical statements, but the material has been left behind. The efficient has been left behind. The final's been left behind. We have only the form of the proposition in the case of logic. And it's either a formally sound argument or it isn't. And there's no consideration of whether or not the premises are correct or whether or not, there's that connection is lost. Okay, yeah, so that's mathematics. Experimental science, if you want to go to that one. So again, and he's going to differentiate experimental science from philosophy of nature. So again, this is the distinction. Experimental science is being just the empirical, as we are not looking at essences per se. We are not trying to look at natures. We are trying to establish facts. And this is where you have the big connection to the physico-mathematical, as he talks about it. Right. So I think this one's fairly straightforward. We start with NS. Yes. We see sensible facts, that there are phenomena that we can observe. And then we can codify them, like you mentioned, into something like Newton's laws of motion, right? We can derive and sit there and say, okay, they're massive bodies move in this way. We can discover inertia or momentum. We can have these laws that are in the case of a lot of the more foundational sciences are completely mathematical. And this takes the place of any kind of understanding of essence, right? We have say E equals mc squared takes the place of an understanding of any kind of essence. It's just entirely mathematical, but it's descriptive. And then from that, the dotted line going back down, now we can make predictions about other sensible facts. Like if we know E equals mc squared, we can build an atom bomb and know how much energy it's going to release and that sort of thing. And it actually goes really back to the sensible.
As a very simple example, if you had to do the physics SAT in recent years, which in the last 5 years or so, like I had, you probably had to study point mass and elliptical orbits. So if you assuming that is actually the correct way to calculate orbits, and there are no more complications to celestial mechanics, then you can sort of say, oh, wow, that planet is behaving oddly. There must be some other celestial object near it that interferes with its supposed orbit from what we know from experience, because that's the only thing that makes sense. Or there is some other fact with mass or something with the planet itself that is different and therefore changes its orbit around the sun, for example. Which is, I think, how we discovered, was it Neptune? Or one of the other planets in the solar system was actually a hypothesis because it was interfering with another planet's orbit. If I remember correctly.
I think you're correct. I don't remember which one it was, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I barely remember. I'm not even sure I remember all the planets in the solar system, I'll be completely honest.
Okay. So then philosophy of nature, and I'll go ahead and dive into it now because I want to make sure we're talking about this a little bit. Is he again very much sees this very clear divide between the experimental sciences and philosophy of nature, and doesn't see the physico-mathematica as a tool to give you philosophies of nature. And I would say modern science would more or less agree with him. He has a quote, I think it's right around here, from Poincaré, who is, let me see it. Yeah, who talks about the object of mathematical theories. This is footnote 49. The object of mathematical theories of physical phenomenon is not to reveal to us the true nature of things. That would be an unreasonable claim. Their sole aim is to coordinate the physical laws that are made known to us by experiment, but with which we could not even express without the aid of mathematics. It is of little importance to us whether ether really exists. This is the luminiferous ether that Einstein kind of managed to shoot down with special relativity. That is the concern of metaphysicians. Again, I would argue it's the concern of physicists that are doing philosophy of nature, of natural philosophers, and not metaphysicians. But this is my pedantry with the language. As far as we are concerned, he concludes, the essential point is that everything happens as if it did exist. So this is Poincaré in the 1900s, back when they were still searching for the ether and were very confident that it was there. But I think it is naive or unsatisfactory to the sciences to sit there and say, okay, we're going to develop our mathematical laws, and very much give up on what he's doing in this diagram with philosophy of nature, that the physico-mathematical can't tell us more about it, right? So for philosophy of nature, we discover sensible facts. This tells us something about essences. We talked earlier about how you sort of derive that man is a rational animal, and then once you have these essences, you can start, or you see that, okay, that man is a thing, there is a substance that is man. You can start talking about what he is, and that happens entirely at the intellectual level, right? It only tangentially makes new contact with sensible fact as you discover new things about man, right? You see that he exists, and then you observe him, and you know his and then you start to reveal his nature. But the actual process of going from the fact that he exists to what he is happens at this higher level of abstraction. And I think what has been lost is when you go back down and make this contact with sensible fact, those can be sensible facts that are revealed by the physical mathematical, right? If you have, say, Newton's laws of motion, right? This is telling these are sensible facts, right? As much as we understand this is telling something about massive bodies. It is telling us something about what mass is, what it means to be massive. Right. This gives us an anest, right? We discovered there is such a thing as mass. That's a property of bodies.
Now, what is it?
Yeah, exactly. But that we can still use the physical mathematical to do those things. Similarly with, say, what Einstein's relativity theory tells us, or Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, or whatever it is we have these laws that we can understand. Okay, there is electric charge. It changes in these ways. This reveals an anest to us and can tell and gives us something to understand those natures better. Again, we've lost this. We don't really try and do, again, except in a very superficial way, because we don't have contact with those fundamental principles or realize what we're doing. And
yes,
as I was saying earlier, people, go ahead.
Continue. I was just remembering that in high school physics, I remember I had a question. You know, at one point we were doing, I remember it was probably celestial mechanics. And I was like, what is mass after all? And basically the best answer I got, it's kilograms. And I very quickly realized the problem with that. I think the closest, the best answer I got was from my dad, who's a computer scientist. Now, that was before even high school physics. And I was asking him about electromagnetic laws. And I was like, well, why do magnetic fields have this shape? And I was just, eventually I got to like the most, you know, after like 3 degrees of why or something, of why this, and then he explains, and then why this, and then he explains. He eventually got, now you're asking to know the mind of God, which I think is probably the best answer I got. And I'm like, okay, fair enough at that point.
And I think that is so unsatisfactory, because
yes, that is very unsatisfactory. But at some point for like a 15-year-old, I'm like, okay, fair enough. It just is. I'll accept it for now.
But the thing is, like, I think most people can't do. Very, very few people existing now can do better, or see a desire to do better. Right? Yes. If you went back even to Newton, and Newton's very clear about this. If you do read some of the Principia, that he sort of realizes what he's leaving behind. Like, okay, like I'm not fleshing out these essences. I'm not saying exactly what these things are. I am making phenomenological claims, but there's work to be done to try and do this. And what happened was it was successful, and people could use it really well. And you could, like I said, you can turn the crank, you can calculate, and you can get answers. And people gave up on doing philosophy of nature, right? But they're very much like you should finish high school physics knowing what mass is, and no one knows what mass is, like including physicists. Like, no one can give a better answer than kilograms.
I'm going to be honest, I still don't know what mass is. By the way,
this is my point. This is exactly my point, is that no one does, and it's not seen as an issue. Yes. Right? It's not just that high school physics students know what mass is, or can talk about an essence for mass. Physicists can't talk about an essence for mass. They can talk about an equation. They can point you to Newton's second law. They can point you to the Higgs field and whatever equations describe it. Mm-hmm. But they've completely lost this idea of this philosophy of nature, that we want to try and understand what it is. We want to understand an nest. Or they get the nest. There is mass.
I'm actually going to put these two. Yeah, I'm going to put these two diagrams actually simultaneously, because this is actually important to my point. So basically, we don't move beyond experimental sciences. We never go into philosophy of nature. We get an nest, or we make a law, and we use it in knowledge that issues in experience, and so on and so forth. We actually do that part, I think, fairly well in modern science. And then, but we don't do any of the philosophy of nature, where we get an nest. You know, this nest here up top is the same as this sensible fact that ensues in an nest. And we don't do the quid-est part. It's just does not happen at all. Mm-hmm. It's not an option.
And it's, again, Maritain sort of shrugs it off and says, yeah, okay, there's I think this is in the next section. He sort of doesn't, says it's not really that big a deal. We can do good things with it. We can leave philosophy to the philosophers, and they don't really need to worry about this. I think it is such a detriment to science, to our understanding, is that we lose so much by not trying to grasp these essences. And I think there are essences that are revealed in a confused way, right? As Einstein is telling us something about the nature of things. Schrodinger is telling us something about the nature of things.
Yes.
But because we don't try and develop these quid-ests, you get these very, like we talked about, these very backward understandings of things. You have people saying that cats are alive and dead at the same time. To use the Schrodinger example.
To be fair, Schrodinger is actually using it as a reductio ad absurdum.
Yes, yes, and people have taken it as clearly your senses are just wrong. Of course, things can be alive and dead at the same time. Don't get me started on that one. Yeah,
he was using it, I think, to rebut the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics or something like that.
Yes, correct.
If I remember correctly. But if what was I going to say right now? Oh my God, I just because I was talking about Schrodinger. Oh no, maybe he's not worried about it because he didn't have a Dawkins around. So he's like, yeah, I have Schrodinger. And if you know Schrodinger, he literally predicted the existence of DNA. That's why the reason Watson and Crick's, is it Crick's or Watson and Crick? I forget. Crick. The reason Watson and Crick were looking for DNA is because they read one of Schrodinger's papers, lecture notes, where he essentially is theorizing on the possible existence of DNA based on how information can actually work in be encoded into a human, and then based on what he understands evolution to be. So Schrodinger, he actually is for the most part really concerned with what is with quid est actually. I do remember there is actually a funny story. I don't know if it's true, it might be apocryphal, from also what my math physics teacher had for several years, where I remember Schrodinger once walked into someone deducing one of his wave equations, and he induced, it was purely inductive for him, it was purely experimental. So he was actually very impressed because he had never heard the deduction before. So he actually finally understood the quid est of what he was talking about, and he praised the lecturer afterwards. This might be entirely apocryphal, but I think it gives an idea to what scientists of the time were concerned about. It was a very much a what is this thing? I mean, there's several others, I forget, maybe it was Niels Bohr or others, that speak very highly of reading Platonic dialogues for understanding what things are. So, as an example,
and you see it a lot in Einstein too. Is he's very concerned with what the thing actually is, and you see it less and less and less. Like by the time you get to Feynman, the sort of the one of the next great geniuses of physics, he's sort of aware there's a problem. He's like, okay, I'm doing things and I have no idea what I'm talking about, and he ultimately sort of shrugs his shoulders and says, "Oh well, I guess we'll just keep going on." And
he's but he's so charismatic, we don't care.
Well,
It's essentially what happened.
Yeah, but he at least realizes there's a problem, right? Like,
yes.
and you know, Einstein and Schrodinger are noticing a problem, and they're actually trying to deal with it, and they're trying to solve it. Feynman sees a problem, has no clue how to approach it, and just sort of moves on. And since, you know, if you look at someone like Hawking, as brilliant as he is, there's no the problem is even gone. Like he doesn't realize there's any problem and starts saying some sort of ludicrous things at some point because of it.
Same with Dawkins. Same with Daniel Dennett, who is a philosopher of specifically mind. Usually, he's a philosopher of mind. But even I think Phaser notes this in what's the name? Last Superstition, which I'm also making my way through. He notes this, that, you know, even like critical studies of Dennett and reviews of him, which are friendly, note that he's a very unsystematic thinker with really just interesting observations, but who really doesn't have a whole system, and a lot of the stuff usually falls apart if you look at it closely. So you sort of get into the same problem with like neuroscience, you get into the same problem in physics, you get into the same problem with biology. You know, you can see this in Dennett, Dawkins, and Hawking. You can see all this in just these 3 case studies. I don't know who would be the example of physics, but I'm sure there are many of understanding what actually are like electrons, what's valency, what's charge, what's bonding, what does that mean, so on and so forth. What does it mean for something to bond to this thing instead of the other because it has a higher valency, even though both one is closer than the other, and you know, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think so much of that is just not being done. And it's interesting, jumping ahead a little bit, because Maritain goes on and talks about this issue in physico-mathematical sciences, and the physics and chemistry in particular. And like I said, he sort of, you know, says that, you know, there's some sort of break in there that we can't really do anything about. But then he starts talking about biological and psychological knowledge. So it's the section called knowledge of a biological and psychological kind. And his conclusion is like, okay, you know, if they're doing things properly, it will naturally lead them to these philosophy of nature questions. As you know, he gives a couple of examples of work being done at the time that I think I was not familiar with, but people were sort of noticing, like, hey, there's some sort of animating principle for these living things. There's some, you know, there's the psychoid or the factor E, or there's these things that, you know, he thought, okay, the people are going to sort of be drawn to the natural conclusions of, okay, the existence of a unifying principle is they're going to discover substances and discover, you know, realize that the Aristotelian idea of a soul, or the Thomistic idea of a human soul, or an animal
that's
soul.
what happened with Edith Stein and Jung, Saint Edith Stein, I should say, and Jung in a different sense. You know, he went back. He was raised, I believe, a Lutheran, but he left it for many years under Freud's influence, who was an atheist, and then he came back to it after his study of essentially the archetypes of the collective unconscious and what they mean, and after reading the gospel. So in his psychological studies, he eventually came back to Christianity, although not a Catholic. So, you know, there are some people around that time who sort of, you know, give Maritain some leeway for thinking this way, but man, he really didn't predict it well.
Yeah, that's the thing, is he sees that, and what happens is the exact opposite. Is those sciences have moved towards the physical, is they have also abandoned a philosophy of nature and become entirely empirical and physio-mathematical. And they do it a lot worse, because, you know, physics, again, if you can reduce, there's not, if you're looking at atoms, there's not a lot of being there, right? You can reduce into quantity very easily. If you're talking about a living thing, you're already at a much higher level of being. And if you're trying to reduce that to quantity, you're having a hard time. If you're trying to do psychology and you're trying to understand a human mind and you're trying to reduce that to quantity, you're hopeless. But that's what's happened, is the successes in the physical mathematical has made biology and psychology say, oh, we're going to do that. So we're going to, if we have enough surveys and things that we can quantify, that's going to tell us something about life. And it has failed so abysmally.
Yes. And there's actually a good observation by our mutual friend that you mentioned earlier in one of his discussions in his CERN podcast, which shall not be named, that I think it was, he was talking about Aristotle's De Anima, where Aristotle makes the observation that the less form there is, the less matter there is, and the less matter there is, the less form there is. And, Aristotle didn't know about atoms, or maybe he did with Democritus. Maybe he'd heard of
nothing like the modern atom, certainly.
Certainly nothing like the modern atom, that's for sure. But maybe he had heard of, some theory of, something which cannot be split up. But even the modern atom can be split up. You can talk about quarks and so on. Sure. But, they have way less form than and way less matter in the terms of fact than a human being, certainly. And, that's a physical observation. And it contradicts his other statement about, philosophy of nature doesn't really have anything to do with metaphysics, or physica can be entirely separate from metaphysics as a science in itself.
Okay. So I want to jump into the conclusions. Do you have any other points before then?
No, I just have a diagram of natural theology if you want to talk about it.
Okay, yeah, we do natural theology real quick when we get back. So I think this would be properly metaphysics as such. So again, we still have to start from the senses. We still have to observe. There is change. There are, like you mentioned with St. Thomas, we start from things that we directly observe: existence of change, existence of things, of intelligibility. We get an anest. There is substance is a thing, form is a thing, matter is a thing. And then he has instead of quid est, we have quid non est. But we can go from there, and we never need to make contact with the physical again. Once you have you understand that they're being as such, you don't need to make contact with sensible facts, and indeed can't even say anything about really valuable about sensible facts at some point, right? It goes back to his discussion on the majesty and poverty of metaphysics in chapter 1, that we're not doing metaphysics to tell us about sensible facts. We're doing metaphysics to tell us about being, right? We're doing metaphysics to better understand, ultimately to understand God, but to understand the super sensible.
Yeah, there's this great quote about we don't need a truth that serves us, but a truth that we may serve.
I shared that with a deacon friend of mine recently, and he was not familiar with Maritain, but his jaw dropped. He's like, I'm going to go write that down. There might be a homily on it. We'll see.
That's so good. That's such a beautiful quote, when it's buried in a treatise on metaphysics in the middle of a paragraph or something. Yep. But yeah, actually, I do have a question here. By quid non est, is he talking about negative natural theology in the sense of I believe it's called it's apophatic and cataphatic. So I forget which one is which, but one is what we attribute to God, that which we can attribute to God, and that which we can at least say negatively, this does not belong to God. So privation does not belong to God, and certain other things. And then by negatively saying that, we can say what does belong to God, or is he just saying this is not existent in material reality? By quid non est.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that, because again, the diagrams are not particularly helpful unless you read all the text around them. I'm trying to see if I can find.
He used the word ananoetic, which I sort of understand it, because I think noetic is that which pertains to the mind. So he's saying an ananoetic intellection, I think, but if I understand, I forget if it's Greek or Latin. I think it's Greek, noetic, I believe. Although right. Anna, I'm not sure. Would be something which is beneath the intellection of the mind, beneath the consideration of the mind. And so you get the sensible facts from the senses, and then there is an anest with an intellection, and then you proceed to the supersensible. But I don't remember if he's talking about bears in the real existence of an immaterial object.
We're both just sitting here just trying to scan through it. I don't think he doesn't directly note it. So I think it is, as like you said, that these things are inherently immaterial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's talking about there is a real existence on an immaterial object to which knowledge by analogy. Oh, and a noetic. Okay, now I understand. It's knowledge by analogy. That's okay. I remember now. Knowledge by analogy. So it's not Anna is not. It's not non. Okay, so it's not non-noetic. Okay, ananoetic. Has been able to rise, beginning with the existence of such an object. Okay, I sort of understand it now.
All thanks to the diagram.
Sort of. Yeah, all thanks to a diagram, baby. Okay, what more notes do you have? Because I have no notes.
I just want to jump to the conclusion where he dumps on Kant again briefly.
Okay, I'll stop sharing that's right always now. Fun.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. What is the point? Is it point?
So it's 32 and 33 are the last two of the chapter.
So first,
because what he's going to get into in chapter 3 is start developing his critical realism, and the point that he makes that I think is excellent is the harmony between Thomistic philosophy and empirical sciences is because it is derived from the real. It won't conflict with the real, right? Its conclusions will naturally be harmonious, superior to its philosophy. It will be superior to the real, but they come from it. So you don't have these problems and things he talks about like mechanism, monism, psychophysical parallelism, Cartesian theory of consciousness, universal evolutionism, because they're, I would say, fundamentally idealist. I might want to use that word more advisedly, but I'm going to stick with it. But they sort of impose their will on, as he says, these systems impose on science the most deplorable metaphysical shackles, is they really keep science from doing what it's supposed to do. Whereas Thomistic philosophy, growing out of sense intuition and sense understanding, like we showed in those wonderful diagrams, is naturally in harmony with those sciences and benefits from them in as much as it can get sensible truths from them, and contributes to them as much as it reveals natures to the sciences, which I think is an excellent point. Just the scholasticism is really the only good way to do science, or a scientific a Thomistic metaphysics is the only reasonable way to do science, because it's the only one that is so properly so correctly understands the relationship between the two.
Yeah, to use as degrees of knowledge, the only proper philosophy of nature is a Thomistic Aristotelian one, is a scholastic one in the end.
And then in 33, he just briefly again, he decides to insult Kant, which I'm always a fan of. I'll for your sake, I'll admit it right now.
No, you can read it. It's fine. It's the first part of 23, I assume.
Sure, yeah. Just Kant denied to metaphysics the character of science, because for him experience was the product and the terminus of science, since science built it by applying to sensible data necessities, which are pure forms of the mind. But St. Thomas recognized in metaphysics the supreme science of the natural order, because for him experience is the starting point of science, which, reading within the sensible given the intelligible necessities that surpass it, can transcend it by following those necessities and thereby achieve a super experimental knowledge that is absolutely certain.
Did you notice that he's using science in a different sense again?
I did, and it's going to we're going to leave that aside.
Yeah, he's using science as knowledge. Every time you get confused by the use of science, just change it for knowledge. That's the only thing I would do if I was a translator. Whenever I notice that it's an equivocal use, I'd put in knowledge. I'd put in or ciencia. I'd put in ciencia.
I think ciencia is a better way to differentiate ciencia as knowledge from science in terms of the experimental science that he uses it to mean half the time.
Yeah, because you can sort of say you have intuitive knowledge of stuff, and that's not really ciencia. Really, you know, you have to build it up to that, to a proper intellection and consideration of the thing. And then you get to experimental sciences and wisdom, what he calls wisdom, which is metaphysics, and philosophy of nature is sort of in between those two. It has relative wisdom, which is another very weird distinction which he makes, but it's an interesting one, which I think it's correct, really. But yeah, so I think this is actually correct. Although, again, the use of science is slightly confusing. Denied to metaphysics. Yeah. It's the product of purely experience, which are application necessities of the form of the mind, which, either and then there's debates about what Kant means about the form of the mind, whether the world conditions the mind or whether the mind conditions the world, whether it's both, and so on and so forth. Roger Scruton tends towards it's both. There are interpretations of that, but that's not interesting. We're here to talk about St. Thomas and Maritain.
the correct thinkers.
Yeah, the correct thinkers.
So unless you have any other points, I'm happy to stop there. We went about twice as long as I think we were attending. I hope this was really interesting. Do you have any last points on chapter 2?
Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if I have any last points except a quick summary. It'd be read the right-hand corner of a first diagram. You sort of get what he's talking about with degrees. That's what he really is concerned with. And he's concerned with abstraction and relative abstraction from the sensible to the suprasensible is his main concern. How that works in the mind, how we attain that. And that's his main concern in this chapter, to argue how that can be and the necessity of how the mind functions in regards to these facts.
Excellent. So this is all going to lead into chapter 3 on critical realism, where he develops his term for what's going to be his basically modernizing of Thomistic ideas again, Thomistic realism.
Mm-hmm.
It's another bear of a chapter. We will see when we get to it. I'm excited to do it. It might be a couple of weeks. I know holidays were sort of a nice time to find some time to read. It might be getting a little bit worse for us, but I definitely want to keep plowing into it.
Yep.
This has been fun. I'm hoping this is interesting for anyone besides the two of us. If not,
yes.
I don't
mind. We'll keep doing it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to get through it regardless. For the 5 people that have enjoyed it so far, please keep it up. We'll keep doing them. It's all for you. It's all to love. Any last plugs, comments, things you want to add in before we adjourn?
You can find me, I guess my only plug is you can find me at available username on Twitter. I might take a break on Twitter. I might do like our mutual friend, take a break for a week. I'm considering doing that after New Year's. But until then, I'll be on Twitter, and then I might be off for like a week. But I'll try to use that extra time of non-internet usage to read through the chapter 3. So hopefully I'll have that ready when I'm back. So that's what I'm planning to do. Hopefully I'll also be able to finish what I'm writing and actually get to it instead of, doom scrolling over Twitter. So that will be fun. That will be very nice if I manage to do that.
What are you writing right now?
I'm writing a quick thing on the nature of hyperreality. It started on as a article on the hyperreality of modern civil marriage. And what that essentially has done to culture. I'm now sort of with my notes so far, I sort of moved on into hyperreality in general and explaining it to a more to people who sort of I say common sense. I was going to use Aristotelian, but it's really people who use common sense and aren't used to continental philosophy. So I'm sort of trying to explain that. And there's actually a very easy way to put it into Catholic terms as well. The very basic analogy is the unity between man and woman in marriage represents the unity between Christ the bridegroom and the church, its bride. And that is represented there. It is a real sign of a real thing. And then civil marriage was originally a sign of the original thing, which is the union between Christ and the bridegroom. So there's another degree of separation. And then modern civil marriage would get, there is absolutely no reference to the sacrament of marriage. It is its own thing. It has no reference to anything else. It lives only for its own sake. That would be the basics that I can use too. That was what I was going to talk about originally, but it might have overgrown it now with my notes.
Looking forward to it. It's gonna be awesome. Okay. I am the Anarcho-Catholic at Eincath on Twitter. At some point, I will finish my article on materialism and idealism. Very relevant concerning some of the things we talked about in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to get written at some point. I promise. I'm so excited to do it, but I've just not been able to finish it. This has been a blast. We will do this again. We will do this again as soon as we are both ready for it. It might be a little while. I want to keep it rolling and make sure we're not falling too behind and haven't forgotten everything. But hopefully some point in January, we'll get to chapter 3 and we'll go from there. Appreciate you guys. We are out of here.